Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this edition of Defense News Weekly, we'll find out about the future of a changing world of missile defense, see an up-close look at a hypersonic warhead, and get the details on more problems with the KC-46 refueling tanker. With in-depth interviews, up-close video, and leading analysis, this is Defense News Weekly. Welcome to this week's edition of Defense News Weekly. I'm July Toro, in for Jeff Martin, who's on assignment in Alabama at the Space and Missile Defense Symposium. But before we get to our team's coverage from there, here's a look at some of the headlines. The Air Force will pay up to $55.5 million for Boeing to redesign the KC-46's boom, but it's going to cost more than that to bring about a final fix. Boeing will get $21 million immediately, but because the contract hasn't been finalized, Boeing could see the cost increase, especially considering the initial award only covers boom redesign. It does not cover the cost of boom testing, development, and fitting. While the service has agreed to foot the bill, Boeing is still responsible for the many other deficiencies delaying the next generation tanker. And Israel is developing combat vehicles that will use artificial intelligence inside a closed cockpit to give soldiers the ability to have 360-degree vision and autonomous driving, all with just a click on a computer screen. Israel's Ministry of Defense revealed the Carmel program, which takes the number of soldiers inside the armored vehicles down to 2. 3 defense companies, Elbit, Israel Aerospace Industries, and Rafael, have made internal suites that were tested for a week. Israel's goal is to have the technologies integrated onto already existing armored vehicles. And the Navy's recently confirmed Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Michael Gilday, will face congressional pressure as he addresses the mounting issues of aircraft carriers. During his confirmation hearing last week, Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Jim Inhofe berated the first-in-class problems of the USS Ford, calling for complete transparency, accusing the Navy of playing fast and loose with immature upgrades to the carrier. Other issues Gilday will face include the impact of hypersonic weapons and the next-generation frigate program. In Huntsville this week at the Space and Missile Defense Symposium, it was clear that the world missile defense is at an inflection point following the release of the Trump administration's Missile Defense Review. One speaker everyone was keen to hear from was a new Missile Defense Agency Director, Vice Admiral Jon Hill. Here's what he had to say.
Most people, when they hear capability and capacity, they think of interceptors and missiles. You know, it's not just that. When people go up to visit Fort Greely, they always want to go into the silos, hug a GBI. I mean, I love doing that. Go see a THAAD battery, go right to the launcher, hug the THAAD missile, go into the ship. Hey, where's the VLS? Let me crawl inside, hug an SM-3. Hey, that's all great. But hey, give a little love to the sensors, right? I see Tim McKay down here, right? It all starts with detect. You know, I'm a very simple guy: detect, control, engage. And so sensing is important. And so we need sensors. We've got to have them at sea, got to have them on land, terrestrial-based sensors when we want to get fancy in our talk. But we definitely need to be in space, because if you have an unpredictable threat that isn't just flying over where you have land-based or sea-based sensors in place, it's just not good enough. So I will reemphasize what my boss, Dr. Griffin, has been saying, the need to be able to look down and see. And that's a pretty complex gig, looking down onto the warm earth, dealing with clutter, looking up into cold space, dealing with the darkness of that, and can you pick out the right thing? But it's an important evolution to the overall capability of the department to really do an all-in missile defense capability. So when you think of capability and capacity, think of those sensors, think of those weapons, and then think about the command and control and the fire control that is required. We have matured so much over the years. It started off with just linking up individual fire control systems. THAAD has its own indigenous fire control. Patriot has its own indigenous fire control. Aegis has that. Ground-based missile defense has that. More and more of that fire control capability is working its way into something called C2BMC, our command and control and battle management. And that's important, because if we are going to do or hit that dream of any sensor or any weapon, I'm not a big fan of that statement, by the way, because I think every one of those kill chains has to be heavily engineered. We've got to make sure that those work. You can't have fragility in that system. But if you want to reach that dream to where you're in an all-domain environment, because the volume is no longer restricted to cruise missiles and hypersonics and space weapons. It is everything coming at you from all axes.
Another key speaker at the event was the commander of the U.S. Northern Command, Air Force General Terrance O'Shaughnessy. After his remarks, he was asked what the most critical needs are when it comes to defending North America from missile attacks. Here's his answer.
The space sensing layer is absolutely key to this. I don't know how you could do it without the space sensing layer. And to me, it's a proliferation of LEO that we need to take advantage of. A little bit of MEO, a little bit of GEO, where you're still going to need some exquisite birds there. But taking advantage of LEO and what LEO gives you, both with the exponential decrease in costs that we've seen. And then you look at Starlink as an example. You saw the picture of the Falcon 9 launch with 60 satellites in one launch. Holy smokes. Talk about being able to move the ball. Things like that completely change our ability to actually sense in this case. And so taking advantage of that proliferation of LEO, taking advantage of things, the advancements that we see in the commercial world, with the example being Starlink, but there's many others out there. Leveraging that, to me, is probably the key thing that we need to do specific to the hypersonic sensing if we're going to be able to ultimately take our undersea, our maritime, our terrestrial, our air breathing, our near space, and our space together. The key thing that we need to focus on there is the space sensing layer. At the end of the day, one of the things that we don't have as a fielded system is really the ability to understand the success of our shots, right? So you take a shot, how did it do? One of the things that we did in FTG-11 as well was to be able to test some of the systems that we need to have for kill assessment. And so we were actually able to, within our headquarters, the N2C2, the NORAD Northcom Command and Control Center, during that operational test of FTG-11, actually put in place a kill assessment capability in the headquarters to actually determine the success and the capability. What would that actually do to the warfighter, and what would that provide the warfighter the ability to do from a decision-making process? And so we had an operational test that was successful, and then from the operator standpoint, validated without any question the value of that capability. And so as we go forward, continuing to bring that in addition to the discriminating radars, in addition to the work that we're doing, becomes critically important, because in the end, if we can take fewer shots, it's the same as building more missiles, right? So if your capacity increases if you have confidence that you were successful in the shots that you have taken, especially as you work the underlayers into the equation with the different shot times of when you would take those shots. So from the operator, the kill assessment capability is critically important. We demonstrated its effectiveness. We demonstrated the operational relevance. And so now back to continue to try to bring it to the warfighter is our push. And we continue in a positive way to bring those kind of new thoughts and new capability into the command centers.
One thing that was obvious from the symposium in Huntsville was that the world of missile defense is changing, and it's not just about ballistic missiles anymore. To learn more, Jeff Martin talked with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Tom Karako.
Tom, thanks for chatting with me here at Space and Missile Defense. Good, enjoying the conference so far?
It's my favorite missile defense conference of the year. Yeah.
All right, so first of all, I think we can start with that term, missile defense, and kind of the terms behind it. It's kind of a misnomer, as we've kind of seen over the past couple of years. What's your take there?
Yeah, I guess I would say that the vocabulary of missile defense has been changing and probably needs to change a little bit more. You know, back in the 1990s, it was all ballistic missile defense, and the acronym was BMD. And now it's kind of become integrated air and missile defense, or just plain missile defense. And that's just a reflection of the fact that there's lots of different kinds of missiles out there. But as I think you were also alluding to the fact that it's also kind of a missile defeat that's going on here in terms of offense and defense. And that's kind of that's the other piece of integration here, is integrating offense and defense, not to play catch, as it were, but to stop, to quiet that launcher, to make the problem go away in different ways.
And that's part of also, I think, a shift in moving missile defense from being necessarily a kind of an extra capability that kind of exists when it needs to kind of integrating it completely into every bit of how the U.S. military fights.
I think that's exactly right. And, you know, because of the ABM treaty, it was perceived as kind of a boutique thing that was disaggregated from everything else that we do in terms of our broad defense goals. And now, again, because there's so many missiles out there, and because over the past 15 years or so, both the technology and also kind of the doctrine and operations have come a long way. You might say the operations and the tactics have just gotten a lot more mature, and so I think that's kind of what you're seeing.
And so, kind of going to be very blunt, is looking with all the threats and everything in the changing landscape, is the U.S. on the right track to be able to do that full-on missile defeat that they need to?
I think so. I think that the Missile Defense Review kind of really acknowledged the complexity of the problem that was put out in January. And then what you're also really seeing is at the services. That's where the real, I think, interesting and most interesting thinking is going on. And so the Army put out its new air and missile defense strategy in, I think it was March. The Navy's distributed maritime operations, and frankly the Marines' Commandant's planning guidance is also looking at how do you distribute your forces, you distribute your fires in different ways to get after this problem.
And so with that problem, one of the kind of the buzzword we've kind of heard, and kind of the joke has been you need to add an H to SMD with kind of the talk about hypersonics and everything like that. What's your take there? Is it kind of an overblown focus, or is it something that really needs to be looked at?
The hypersonic threat is very real, but I think it's also able to be overblown. And what do I mean by that? Well, hypersonic missiles are just a different kind, just a more sophisticated, more maneuverable, and in terms of degree, faster relative to some threats. But they're not 10 feet tall. It's a complex air defense problem, but they're not unstoppable. And so we have to have a different sensor architecture. We've got to have different and more maneuverable effectors to get after them. But it's fundamentally doable to kind of counter these things, but not impossible.
Not impossible. And then looking at MDA itself, with that change in kind of how missile defense is being looked at, is MDA kind of on the right track for what they need to do?
I think that they're getting a good start in FY20, and I think Congress in particular on a bipartisan and bicameral basis said, no, we really want you to go after the space sensors. And they kind of put in $108 million for what was MDA's top unfunded priority to go after the sensor payload development. And that's absolutely critical. And there's a lot of good thinking going on in terms of, okay, what's the architecture? What kind of effectors do we need for this mission? And so I actually think you're probably going to see some contracts related to that particular piece come out, be announced pretty soon. And they're thinking big thoughts about how all this is going to fit together.
And so MDA is kind of organizational focused. They're kind of under the R&E Undersecretary right now. Do you see a change in that? Do you see a change that's needed for where they are within the Pentagon? I don't
think it needs to change yet. I would acknowledge, however, a little bit of a tension. You know, A&E and RNS, ANS and R&E used to be in one shop, AT&L. And the challenge there is that the Missile Defense Agency both does science projects and research and development. That looks more like the R&E side. But they also do procurement. And they do sustainment of a lot of these big systems like GMD up in Alaska. And so in that respect, what you're seeing begin to emerge is a little bit of a tension of who's the right person to oversee MDA. Now Congress in legislation said, no, we really want it to be R&E, so Mike Griffin.
MDA was originally started as a cutting-edge R&D shop for missile defense.
Right, but the thing is, they've also, building stuff and procuring stuff that's fielded, and in some cases been fielded for 15 years now, like GMD. And so the question is, well, should they also, to what extent, report to acquisition and sustainment? Congress and legislation said we want it to be ANS or R&E, but the Missile Defense Executive Board that oversees it. There's some ideas out there. Do you kind of co-chair it between the two undersecretariats? It's something that we've worked out. It's important though, because it's hard to have two bosses.
It's hard to have to have one boss sometimes too. And then finally, looking at everything that we've kind of seen, kind of walking around the floor and everything this week, it's a lot different than last year here. Yeah. We have an MDR. We have everything in that regard.
True. Well, first of all, I'm not going to tell Jill that you said that, but it is a little different in the respect that. There's, I would say, some enthusiasm, some momentum in terms of the fact that the Missile Defense Review is out there, and the budget's not quite there to align us yet. But yeah, I think you're going to see a lot of movement in the next year for programmatics, especially on the counter-hypersonic, but also kind of adapting what it is we do for missile defense to these new concepts, multi-domain battle and all that stuff.
All right, Tom, thanks for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.
To keep up to date with all of our coverage, be sure to visit our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn pages. Also, be sure to add us on Apple's News app and other platforms for the latest updates. When we come back, we'll hear from the Army's head of hypersonic weapons development about what's next for the cutting-edge programs he runs. Lieutenant General Neil Thurgood runs the Army's Rapid Capabilities and Technology Office, tasked with putting the latest technology into the field fast. One key part of their work is hypersonic weapons, and in Huntsville, the general talked with land warfare reporter Jen Judson about where the programs stand.
Okay, all right, I mean, there's so much to talk about. You know, obviously we spoke a couple months ago, but, you know, I was already seeing some new things that you were highlighting this morning. You know, you've got some major contracts coming up that you're looking to award, you know, one having to do with the hypersonic launcher, the other one having to do with production. So I'm wondering if you could detail that process a little bit more, what you're looking for in both of those different efforts that will sort of close out what you need to award in order to proceed with your prototypes.
Yeah, so in the long-range hypersonic weapons system, we're the land component of the overall conventional prompt strike mission set. In order to do that, we're synced with the Navy, the Air Force, and the Missile Defense Agency as the four pillars to that conventional prompt strike mission set. In that relationship, the Army owns the responsibility for the production of the glide body, the common hypersonic glide body. And so, using the authorities that Congress has given us, the other transaction authorities, we went out to industry so we could transition that technology out of government labs into the commercial industrial base. And so we had a lot of participation from industry. They were very interested, very supportive. And so since we received the mission in March, the approval for the mission in March, for the LRHW program, which includes the production of the glide body, we went put out an OTA announcement, received the white papers, have made that selection for several people who have the potential to make the glide body. Because we need to create an industrial base, so you pull one at a time in a traditional leader-follower methodology, and we invite that company to go out to Sandia, who's a great partner, and we learn how to make the glide bodies. And when that company is done, then we take a second company out there and we learn how to do the same thing again with a second company. Okay. So in that methodology, we create not only the prime industrial base, but we energize the supply chain below the prime to create an enduring industrial base for the nation should we decide to make a large number of these type of weapon systems.
Okay. How many times do you plan on going through that iteration where you have, you know, a company working with Sandia, sort of in succession?
Well, right now we're planning on one. That company has been selected. We're in the contract negotiation, final contract negotiations now, so we won't talk about that. And depending on how many of these things the Army, the Navy, the Air Force want to produce, and MDA want to produce, then that drives the capacity we need to produce or have the production capacity. So right now we're focused on our first one, and then whatever the outcome is that our nation desires, then we'll drive that capacity with others.
Okay, okay. And then if you could speak a little bit also about what you need to do with the launcher side of things. This is specific to the Army, since you will need to be, you know, ground mobile, road mobile.
Right, right.
So this is another sort of from the ground up effort in terms of developing a launcher. This doesn't also exist in the world either. So.
Yeah, so as part of the mission set for the long-range hypersonic weapon in the land component of the conventional prompt strike umbrella, we have to be road mobile. So that means you have to have it on a trailer and pull it with a truck. And we have both of those trucks and trailers in the Army inventory today. What we don't have is a vertical launch mechanism to launch the actual weapon itself. That is not necessarily new. We've had those in years past, these launch mechanisms. And so similar to the glide body production, we went out to industry and said, we need help. We need a systems integrator who can take the command and control system, can take the weapon and put it all together on a truck and a trailer and a command and control system to use as an actual weapon. So we went, again, another OTA adventure using exactly what Congress gave us OTAs to do was prototype efforts. And so we did that. We made that selection. We're in that final negotiation. We anticipate both that system integrator contract and the glide body contract to be awarded by the end of August, just as we were approved to do. And so they'll have to do the integration, including the design of the, we call it a transport erector launcher, so that we can get the system, vertical enough to actually launch.
Is there anything that has to be unique about the launcher because it's a hypersonic missile, or is it, we're just looking at a launcher that fits a specific glide body, the specific missile?
Well, it's unique to this weapons system, because the weapons system has on the truck is 2 canisters. The actual round sits in the canisters, and so those canisters just lay onto the, are mounted onto the trailer itself that gets vertically established. And so that's, so you can put different canisters on there. That's not necessarily unique. The vertical launch piece is not necessarily unique because the magic of the round, if there is such a thing, happens in the canister, right? That's where the round is, that's where you launch it from. It leaves the canister with the engine ignited, so we call that a hot launch. And so the mechanism of the launcher, the purpose of the transport erector launcher is just to get it in a launching position. Everything else happens inside the canister.
And when we come back, we'll look at what happens when a hypersonic warhead hits solid granite. On this week's Money Minute, Navy Federal Credit Union personal finance expert Brian Parker offers his latest tips.
Deciding whether or not to close your credit card can be tricky. There are times when it makes sense to cancel it, but other times when it doesn't make sense. You really have to look at your whole credit picture to make the best decision for you. First, figure out if closing your card is even necessary. Are you paying an annual fee for a card you don't use? Are you tempted to overspend? Consider closing unused cards that are costing you money. It's important to also think about the timing. Your credit score is primarily based on your credit report. If you're young and don't have a long credit history, closing your first credit card may have a more negative impact on your credit profile. Now, if you have a long positive credit history, your score may take less of a hit. If you're considering applying for a loan or mortgage, you may want to wait. Lastly, do your best to ensure your balance to limit ratio is low on all your cards, not just on the one you may want to cancel. Lenders typically look for a ratio of under 30% as a positive sign that you can manage your debt. Now, if you're smart, your creditworthiness doesn't have to take a hard hit. Talk to a financial institution you can trust about what's best for you.
Thanks, Brian. We'll see you next week. To get more defense news coverage, be sure to visit our website at defensenews.com and subscribe to our early bird brief, delivered to your inbox every weekday morning to get you ready to start the day. And when we come back, we'll look at what happens when a hypersonic warhead hits solid granite. Hypersonic weapons were definitely a talking point in Huntsville, but at one booth, there was a lot more than just a model on display. Here's Jeff Martin's report.
So when we're at trade shows like the one we're at here in Huntsville, Alabama, we only see a lot of models. We don't see actual things that are represented that we're talking about, except what I've got here. I'm over at Northrop Grumman to see, this is a hypersonic reentry vehicle that actually impacted at a Mach 4 with granite. So you can see it's been through a little bit. Mark's here with Northrop Grumman to kind of tell me about it. Mark, what can you tell me?
Well, this is a hypersonic penetrator. It was part of a joint Air Force Army program to see how they would survive into granite and how deep they would go. There was a lot of questions whether they would survive.
Why granite?
There's a lot of, it's what mountains are built of, and some of the targets that people are looking at are built into granite mountains to protect the sites. So the question is, how far down into natural rock can you go? So these were a series of tests we did. Doesn't a lot known. We learned a lot on the series, the free tests we did. Delivered by a hypersonic maneuvering reentry vehicle, very precisely. And we developed this, had it machined locally, and flew it into granite. You can see actually the granite solidified on the outside. When it came to rest, the pink granite actually solidified on the outside of the penetrator.
So no, this test was done back in the late 90s, but we're here, hypersonics are the #1 buzzword that we're hearing here at this show. What application is what we have here to kind of what everybody's talking about here? It
has direct applications. For a number of years, that wasn't the important thing. We had fewer enemies at the time. This now is new again. The capability to do this, it's actually hollow on the inside, so we were looking at that. Northrop Grumman has the capability to do the warheads, fusing maneuvering reentry vehicles, et cetera, for hypersonic delivery of warheads.
Great. And finally, looking at this, what's kind of what did you guys what was the number one thing you learned out of this? You were saying you learned some lessons. What was the biggest thing you learned?
They learned that at the time that all the models were wrong.
Okay.
How far you could go, if they would survive or not. We were actually pushing it each time. But everybody flew the first one at 3,000 feet per second, and 3,300 feet per second actually. And they said, okay, now above 3,500 feet per second, they can't survive. So we flew this one at 4,000. And as you can see, it survived very well. Still has this nice pointed nose, etc. So we kept pushing the envelope out, and really found that a lot of what people thought they knew was wrong at the time.
All right, Mark, thanks for the time. I really do appreciate you, sir.
That's all we have time for this week. But if you want to see and read more, be sure to head over to defensenews.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.